It's actually a really important concept in healthcare and medical care, and unfortunately, we don't really talk about it because it's not something that lends itself very easily to study from an outside-in kind of perspective. And by that, I mean that we may have people suffering the exact same kind of symptoms, whether it is something like a neuralgia, or whether it's something like a vertigo, or whether it's something like a chronic fatigue, or something that's affecting really any part of the body. And on the surface, you may have two people who experience the exact same thing. But in terms of how they got there, and also what their healing pathway needs to be, you can actually have very significant differences. And it's maybe a different conversation for a different kind of time, but what I want to just look at here right now is what's actually involved in the healing process. And in brief, there can be two general kinds of pathways. One of them is called repleting, and then the other one is called retracing, or sometimes it's called unwinding, or de or recompensating. And the problem is that when you've got two people on the surface, until you start working with them, you don't necessarily know which way it is that they are going to respond. So let's look at this in terms of the relationship of what happens with the, upper part of the neck. Well, we've talked about this at other times in other places, that when you've got a physical injury that has affected the, structural integrity of those joints in the upper part of the neck right here, what it does is it starts to impede the quantity and the quality of the information that normally needs to be transmitted between your brain and between the rest of the body. And sometimes it produces instant symptoms, but other times it can be more like compound interest that simply and slowly accumulates over a long period of time to the point where your body just really can't compensate anymore. And because that area we're talking about is the brainstem, which is only the master control center for everything in the body, well, you can start to experience symptoms in any part. It can affect how you feel. It can affect how your brain works. It can affect how the bits and parts of your body move. It can affect how the bits and parts of your body have the opportunity to work. But we're not really talking so much about that in this particular point in this conversation right here. We're talking about more, well, what happens or the different, pathways from a philosophical perspective in terms of how that can lead to problems, but more importantly, how that can relate to healing. So if we were to use an analogy first, and we could talk about a simple example like a electrical cable that's going to two refrigerators, okay? Now, I'll talk about where we're going to be, diminishing the power supply, turning the power off, something like that. And yes, I'm well aware one of the limitations with this kind of metaphor is, we're not talking about turning the power off in the body. If we turn the power off between the brain and the rest of the body, well, that's called death. But we're talking about, from a metaphorical perspective, as if those life messages are not able to get through and the body's then not able to function the way that it should. In other words, there's not as much electricity, not as much juice going from your outlets into these two fridges. And let's say then that these two fridges on the outside are 100% identical. And on the inside of these two fridges, this is where it's different. One of them is completely empty. And the other one, you don't know this, but your neighbor has just completely stocked your fridge up for you. So you've got meat, you've got fruit and veg and all of this sort of stuff, you're good to go. But in this particular example, let's say then that your neighbor did not know that you were actually about to go on holidays for the better part of around 4 weeks. And so what do? Well, if you know that you're going to be going away for any length of a time, one of the things that you might do is you might shut off all of the electricity in the house in case there's a storm surge or something like that and you don't want, for a fire or for any of the appliances to go out. So what have you done? You've basically severed the electrical supply to these two fridges. and you go on your holiday and you have a wonderful time, and then you come back home, and one of the first things that you do is you turn the power on. Now again, remember that the two fridges from the outside, they look quite exactly the same. And let's talk about first the fridge that didn't have anything in it. Well, you turn the fridge on, you open it back up, and what do you see? You see the power is flowing exactly as it was before. But then let's say that you open the other fridge up, and in the other fridge, you've got an absolute nightmare on your hands. You've got rot, you've got spoil, you've got all kinds of horrendous smells, horrendous things going on. It's going to take an awful lot of time to clean up. So what's my point in this metaphor? My metaphor and the point of this is that when you have discommunication or dysfunction in coordination between the brain and the rest of the body, you can develop different kinds of problems or symptoms by either of these two pathways. In the first pathway, it's a matter where, simply put, the electrical juice is not flowing the way that it should be. But on the other side, even though, yes, you could still have a few symptoms and a few problems and things like that, there really hasn't been any tissue damage or disrepair, or anything's really going awry. And so in that particular case, what you may do is you may, go to see the, upper cervical doctor or the nutritionist or whoever that's going to be, and they give you that, quote, one thing. They give you that little adjustment, that little procedure, and instantly your body and you experience such incredible relief. It's as if you have jumped from the very bottom, boom, straight up to the top, and you are exactly as you were, say, 5-10 years ago. You're 60 years old and you say, I feel like I was when I was 20. How did that happen? It feels like somebody just turned the lights back on in my life. Well, as we said, it's not exactly like the power was off per se, but the power wasn't flowing properly. And if there has been no damage to any of the tissue in your body, then yes, that's exactly what we would hope and expect to happen. But now here's the thing, is that, remember, there's going to be the other situation, and from the outside, again, they look quite exactly the same. And so I want you to imagine instead that you are the person where things maybe haven't been going right in your life, and you've been on a bit of a downhill spiral for 10 years or so. And in that period of time, what has your body had to do? It's had to find ways to compensate. And so you may have some degenerative arthritis. You may have changes in the tissue structure, in your muscle structure, in your organ structure. Your body has found certain ways to adapt, but then there are also certain ways that it has degenerated over that period of time. And so in that particular case, even when you restore that connection and the power starts going between the outlet and between that fridge with all the rotten food in it on the inside, well, guess what's going to happen? There's not going to be an instantaneous lift. In fact, what's going to have to happen is only when you restore that connection, that's when your body really has to go through the repair process. And it can oftentimes take a really, really long time. It is an anecdotal rule of thumb, but it's nevertheless a really useful one, is that in order for any person to heal from a chronic condition, it's going to take 1 month for every year that the problem has been there, whether or not there were symptoms. And so this is following the process of what we call retracing or recompensating. It's in brief something like this. It's where your body, you suffered that initial injury, and what you've been doing is you've been spiraling down like this for a long period of time. And so you get that initial correction for your upper neck or whatever else it is that you need to be, and you hope and expect that it's going to be a case where your body repletes or replenishes, where it goes from all of that damage and boom, straight back up to the top as you were. But that's not the pathway when you've had the damage. When you've had the damage and it's gone down like this, what needs to happen is it needs to unwind. It needs to retrace. It needs to recompensate or go back through all of those layers of compensation that happened to undo the damage. And that's ultimately how you get your body back to health, well-being, and things like that. And so this is one of the reasons why I say, especially when people have very chronic conditions, it's going to take time. But they're going to say, but I went on the internet and I saw all of these blogs and all of these reviews and all of these reports of people who had gone to the doctor, they'd gone to the upper cervical chiropractor, they'd gone to the nutritionist, they'd gone to have whatever kind of treatment, therapy, or repair that you can think of. And they had these amazing responses and they were fixed in, 3 months or less than that, things like that. And the point that I need to raise here is, yes, that does happen. And that's what we want every single time. But these people were on this kind of pathway. And in this pathway, yes, their body was able to jump exactly back to where it was. But if you are on a different pathway, that's not actually a fair or a realistic expectation. Yes, we can still believe that within limitations of time, gravity, stress, all of these kinds of things, that your body can and will continue to heal and to repair so that you can live the best quality of life possible up until your very last breath. But we can't expect it to jump all the way back if the retracing process needs to happen. And so in that, we need to be able to understand that healing is going to take time. So there are the two different pathways, and that's important to understand, but there's one other thing that's kind of important that I do just ever so briefly want to mention, and it's this. It's that when we see or hear about all of those amazing stories, when people have had great results, and it's not to take, hope away from anybody or anything like that, because again, this is what we want to see all of the time. Again, it's not the doctor, it's not the chiropractor that heals, it's the wisdom and the power that, made and give life to your body. That's what does the healing. And it can do amazing things, far better than I could ever, hope for or expect to give you or anything like that. But we nevertheless need to appreciate and understand that healing takes time. Miracles sometimes take just a little bit longer. And if we start to put forth our own expectations that, I need to be this healthy, I need to be this well within this certain period of time, what we're actually doing is we're setting ourselves up for failure. We are comparing ourselves to other people without realizing that there can be some very real fundamental differences between what's going on. Again, one person, even though on the surface they may look quite identical, all that they needed to do was turn the power back on and their problem was solved. But other people, even though they're experiencing the same symptom, the pathway that got them there is completely different. And so the pathway to get out of that also needs to be completely different as well. And if we are then comparing the outcome in and of itself and the time frame without the appreciation of A, what actually got us there, but B, what's actually going to be necessary to get us out, we can very easily become dissuaded, down in the dumps, depressed, even to the point that we may actually quit on the very thing that is necessary for us to be well. But why did we do it? It's because our expectations were not genuine. We were hoping for a miracle or a fairy tale, when in reality, that was not, what we needed. Again, healing, yes, miracles do happen, but we still and nevertheless need to be able to give that innate wisdom of the body the time, the opportunity to do so. And it's simply put important that we don't put our unrealistic expectations on the situation. Otherwise, we could just be asking for trouble. And especially when it comes to getting back our health quality of life, we need to just make sure that we're taking things one little step at a time and appreciating all of those little victories as we're going along. Because sure enough, all of those little victories over a long enough period of time, they're going to start to add up. They can make a really big difference if we let them.